What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review the new horror film In a Violent Nature, which is opening theatrically this weekend, and then launching on Shudder later this year. But this movie made a big splash as part of the kind of like the midnight screenings at Sundance earlier this year, and I must admit, it was one of my most anticipated movies of the summer. We're seeing a very weird summer movie season, but I was hoping that maybe, fingers crossed, some of these horror films would deliver. And In a Violent Nature, it's sadly one of those situations where I have to review the film that we have as opposed to the film that I wanted to see because I really wanted to like it. I'm rooting for it, and I'm still hoping that the movie will make piles of money. But it has a couple scenes that I really like, but it's got quite a few problems, which I won't get into too many details initially because I'll be going spoiler-free, but at a certain point in this video, the gloves will have to come off, and I'll have to explain why I was so frustrated with this movie overall. Also, I should probably acknowledge the minor gash that I have on my forehead. If you're wondering what happened, I wish I could claim that I went to see In a Violent Nature and that they had like some actor dressed up as the killer from the movie and that he was beating me over the head with one of those pieces of logger gear that are featured so prominently throughout the movie. But nothing that exciting happened. I was playing Bloodborne earlier today, and if you've ever played a video game by From Software, occasionally you will get frustrated with yourself for being impatient and dying when you should have been patient, waited for an opportunity. And I was so mad, I took my PS5 controller and I went, and I just kind of bopped myself on the head a few times, not realizing there's a little crease along the edge of the controller. And suddenly I looked up and yes, I was bleeding down the forehead. If you've never, or if you've ever cut your forehead before, you'll know the forehead and the scalp bleed very freely. And if your reaction to that story is that I'm way too emotionally and intellectually immature to be reviewing any movie of any kind, I will totally understand that response, but we're going to do the best that we can in spite of all my loss of brain cells from inflicting bodily harm on myself. But let's start with the basics on this movie. Here's the description from Wikipedia. In a Violent Nature is a 2024 Canadian slasher film written and directed by Chris Nash. Described as an ambient slasher, the film follows a mute killer who targets a group of teenagers in the Ontario wilderness, with the events observed largely from the killer's perspective. In a Violent Nature premiered on January 22nd at the Sundance Film Festival as part of the festival's midnight program. It is set to be released theatrically in the United States by IFC Films on May 31st, and then on the streaming service Shudder later that year. And that more or less gets it done. But what sets this slasher film apart from other slasher films? They decided to basically give you like the killer's perspective on your typical slasher scenario. Much like a lot of the slasher classics that I grew up on back in the 1980s, it features a lake, it features a big hulking killer with a lot of exotic weapons and a mask, and it features a lot of people in their late teens and early 20s who are, drinking, smoking weed, trying to hook up, blah, 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 as they slowly but surely get picked off one at a time. But when I saw the trailer, I was like, this is going to be so goddamn cool, because at least from the trailer, it implied that the entire movie was going to be done with that kind of over-the-shoulder perspective where we see the entire story unfold from his point of view. And I was like, all right, you finally found a way to breathe fresh life back into the stalest of genres. Because even though I love slasher movies, when I was a kid, I would walk down the aisles of the video store and be like, oh, here's a slasher movie I've not seen. Like, there was no slasher movie that was too amateur or too cheap or just too lame or awful where I wasn't willing to at least give it a shot. And also, in my opinion, a low budget or bad writing or bad direction or amateur acting, like none of these are obstacles to a slasher film succeeding, because all you have to do is deliver the goods, whether that's through kick-ass kill sequences or really sexy hookups or great music or just a great central character that you can get invested in. And as a little kid in the 1980s, more often than not, I was rooting for the killer, and so that was yet another reason why I was really excited for In a Violent Nature, because it seemed like they were going to finally allow us to completely embrace the idea that all these late teens and early 20-somethings, they're annoying as hell. They're just completely obnoxious. Let's watch them get dispatched one at a time and cheer. And in my opinion, this movie features one major show-stopping scene where it finally delivered on the experience that I was expecting and hoping for, where the kill was so deranged and so elaborate and so complex and so detail-oriented. I could hear people in the crowd just like laughing and guffawing just how ridiculous and over top the whole sequence was. But I gave a little light, kind of mild clap. I didn't want to annoy the people around me, but I was in awe of what they decided to put up on the screen. But sadly, scenes like that are few and far between in this movie. A movie which I must admit, it's only 94 minutes long. It's like the perfect running time for a slasher movie. However, due to one horrible scene toward the end of the movie, it's going to feel like 194 minutes. Like, oh my God, why are y'all wrapping your movie up with this endless, boring, just completely, just unwatchable bullshit. And no matter what happens in a slasher movie, you got to send the audience out of the theater talking and laughing and screaming and just chattering about what they just saw. Like, take a movie like Sleepaway Camp. That movie's a fucking mess. However, at age 10, I had a friend over for a sleepover. We saw this elaborate VHS box cover with a tennis shoe with a knife through it. Like, that looks good. Let's watch that. And the kind of the outrageous dialogue at the time didn't make a huge impression on me. Like, later on, as I became an adult, I realized, oh my God, that like the dialogue in this movie is completely deranged, and a huge part of why that movie has enduring appeal. But the reason people still talk about that movie is because of the reveal at the end of the movie, one of the most outrageous, and I won't even say controversial, just outlandish big reveals. And I won't say what that reveal is if you haven't seen it. But if you've not seen Sleepaway Camp and you want to see a sleazy 80s slasher classic, I would definitely recommend people hunt that one down.
Sleepaway Camp. You won't be coming home.
But that ending is so insane that 40 years later, people are still talking about and watching Sleepaway Camp, or at least people within kind of the horror fan community, or people who just love watching really trashy, really sleazy, just really aggressive horror movies filled with a lot of sex and violence. I guess that's what it all boils down to. If you're going to make a slasher movie, well, then you've got two main ingredients that you can kind of stir into your soup to try to make a big impression on people, and you can overemphasize one or the other as long as you're like going all in. In a Violent Nature chooses to be completely celibate and chaste as a nun, and you don't have to have people hooking up in showers or getting stabbed with a spear. But if you're not going to deliver any sex appeal of any kind, well, then you need to have just the most kick-ass horror movie imaginable. And this movie, once again, I don't feel like the filmmakers quite knew just how cool the concept was of doing the movie totally over the shoulder of the killer. And this is a mild spoiler, so bail out now if you want to go into the movie totally cold. But the movie doesn't have the courage of its convictions. It's almost like it got some notes from whoever financed the movie, like, we really need a few scenes where we flesh out the teenage characters at the core of it, and those scenes are unendurable. There's a campfire scene where basically the central characters that are all just being taken out by the killer one at a time, they basically give us all the lore or the backdrop of who this killer is and some of the conflicting myths and legends about him and that sort of thing. But the way it's staged, the way it's written, the way it's performed, and the way that it's shot, I was like, I might have to walk out of this movie. It's like 15 minutes long, and it's so amateur and so lame and so ineffective. And most important of all, it breaks the kind of the main conceit or the main gimmick of this movie, because the killer's nowhere to be seen until the very end. It's like, well, the whole movie is supposed to be from the killer's point of view. Why are you trying to get us invested in these characters? I feel like it would have been much more interesting if we had just been hearing their dialogue off in the distance, hearing how annoying they are, and just seeing the killer slowly but surely, almost like, how dare you just spoil like the peace and quiet of this natural, serene environment that I love so dearly. I must come in and, put you in a wood chipper and that sort of thing. And so it does bug me that this movie didn't stick with that format, because we have seen that format work before. And if you'll forgive me for indulging in a really obscure movie reference, but there's a director by the name of Alan Clark, where in the late 70s and 80s, they basically were doing the most savage hardcore movies done in the UK at that time. And I'm talking about movies like Scum, which was pulled from release, and then he had to remake his own movie and make it a little softer before releasing it theatrically, but hunt down the original Scum. He made Made in Britain, which is one of the movies that put Tim Roth on the map. He made a soccer hooligan movie called The Firm with Gary Oldman, which is just fucking incredible. But he also made this little movie called Elephants, 39 minutes long. It's not short enough to be a short. It's not long enough to be a feature. But all it is a series of killings from over the shoulder of this killer in Northern Ireland, where you're like, who is this guy and why is he killing all these people? And it allows the audience to basically, like, whatever you bring to the table and your knowledge of the troubles and the tensions in Northern Ireland, like, you will come away from them. Everybody's going to come away from the movie with a wildly different experience. But what can't be denied is that it's just an incredibly brutal, visceral, unforgettable experience. So anybody who's ever seen any movie by Alan Clark, like, they never fully recover from the experience. But Elephant's just like, oh my fucking God. So I thought In a Violent Nature was going to do for the horror genre what Elephant did for political turmoil in the late 80s. But I'm not going to rip a movie to pieces for failing to be as memorable as an Alan Clark film. And Alan Clark's appeal is niche, but those people who love Alan Clark, like when those people encounter one another, they're like, oh my God, let's talk about Alan Clark movies. So yeah, if you have a taste for the rough stuff and the dark side, definitely check out his movies. But let's talk about something this movie does do well. they have this little trick where you overhear little scraps of dialogue from the characters that kind of flesh out the backdrop or the lore of this, and it very much is in keeping with, or is kind of I guess it maintains a certain tradition in the slasher genre where it feels like it could be yet another chapter in an ongoing franchise where we just haven't seen the earlier installments. Because if you're paying close attention, it sounds as if like every 10 or 15 years or so, somebody will do something stupid, which kind of sets this killer on the warpath again. So I enjoyed that, because when I first discovered the Friday the 13th franchise, I started with part 4, the final chapter, and I feel like in a lot of ways I kind of won the lottery in terms of which slasher film that I started with. It's kind of for me like the template by which all other slasher films have to be judged. And I can recognize that John Carpenter's Halloween is a more important film in the slasher genre, or that Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street was a more like kind of like visceral, intoxicating, just stylish, just kick-ass experience. And I was a huge Freddy Krueger fanatic throughout the 1980s, although at times I got to push back on the idea on a Nightmare on Elm Street being part of the slasher genre, because it's so supernatural and has so much about like dreams, and it feels like it's going into a different genre. But if you want to call it a slasher film, yeah, I won't kick. The term slasher is very broad, and it can apply to a lot of different movies. But getting back to Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, in that movie, it has every single ingredient that I wanted from a slasher movie at that time, where you've got compelling central characters. I mean, you got Corey Feldman in there, little horror freak who's into all of his little toys and props and that sort of thing, who knows a lot about the origins of Jason Voorhees. You have some outrageously fun and interesting and entertaining teenage characters who just want to smoke weed and screw and skinny dip and that sort of thing. And in that cast, you've got guys like Crispin Glover delivering like one of the all-time great, just weird, deranged dance sequences.
Don't think you got it made, no, you're wrong.
And I feel like in the absence of money and in the absence of like production value, you have to just go to the weird side and unleash your actors and give us something that we've never seen before, but something that only requires like kind of the creativity and the improvisational flair of your cast. And this movie has none of that. The human characters, or the victims in this movie that are being picked off, they're either really boring or have no personality at all, or are incredibly annoying. And once again, if they'd stuck to the format of only letting us be in the head of the killer, then I think that would have been totally fine. The moment the movie starts trying to ask us to care for these characters, to getting invested in these characters, that's where it starts to run into some serious problems. So once again, it's almost like the movie can't quite figure out, do they want to be like an art house experimental horror film, or do they want to be just your typical PG-13 kind of campy, cheesy slasher movie, and is trying to kind of do both, but not really fully succeeding in either. But if you compare that to something recent like the Terrifier franchise, I feel like the Terrifier movies, those movies know precisely what they're trying to be in terms of the tone, the style, like the extreme gore. Those movies are going for it, and I'm fired up for Terrifier 3. It can't arrive soon enough. But getting back to In a Violent Nature, I will say this. I had a great experience watching the movie. I went down to the Alamo Drafthouse in Lower Manhattan, completely sold out theater, got a nice pizza, got a nice Coke, and the audience was totally on the movie's wavelength. You know, there no phones, no talking, no distractions. It was just, everybody that was there wanted the best possible horror experience. And given from some of like the cheers and the laughter and the claps, people were definitely getting into it, or at least getting into it more so than I was. And judging by that little bubble, you'd assume, summer movie season is alive and well. But the reality is, I think New York does have a lot of cinephiles and a lot of movie fanatics, and when they get together, they can create the illusion that all is well. But I was really hoping that In a Violent Nature might be one of these kind of secret, unexpected, runaway breakout sensations where they make the movie for, I don't know what they made it for. I'm sure they made it for, a couple $100,000 or maybe $1 or $2 million. But I was hoping it was going to be one of those unexpected successes that would just explode and make piles of money and get everybody talking about going to the movies this summer. And I just don't think it's going to make much of an impact on people unless they are already complete and total psychos for the slasher genre. And I guess my question is, unless you're in your 40s, who are the slasher fans? Because in the 1980s, you had like your big slasher franchises, but you had all the copycats and all the ripoffs. Like every successful slasher movie, like Friday the 13th, would launch like 100 imitators, and so you could basically spend all day, every day watching slasher movies. But do people even care about slasher movies anymore? Like Chris Nash, I don't know how old he is, but I don't get the impression that what he wanted to deliver was like the ultimate slasher movie. What it seems like to me is that Chris Nash was basically putting together like a highlight reel so that he could get a job making a movie for A24. It seems like art house horror is what he's going for, not like, the best and or the worst of 1980s slasher movies. And who knows, I don't even know if a slasher movie done in the style of an 80s movie would play well to audiences in 2024. Who the hell knows? But I think a lot of people are going to regard this movie as a mixed bag or frustrating. But once again, I'm conflicted because there are a few traditions and movies that I love more than young filmmakers going off into the woods with very little money and coming out a few weeks later with enough raw footage to edit together their first horror film. Whether you're talking about Evil Dead or whatever the case might be, but I feel like that is a tale as old as time where a bunch of people head out into the woods and come back with a movie that's destined to be a midnight movie classic or a hit on home video or whatever. In A Violent Nature, I just don't think it's going to be that breakout movie. But your mileage may vary, and I'm going to recommend that if you see the trailer and it's right up your alley, definitely check it out. But just go into it recognizing that as cool as the trailer makes it appear to be, the filmmaker, like I said before, he just didn't quite have the courage of his convictions to stick with that format. And when the movie falls apart, it's any time that he abandons that format. But if you're a fan of horror movies, all is not lost. We still have Longlegs and Maxine to look forward to later this summer, both of which could end up being really cool movies. But I think I've talked enough at this point. It's getting me in the mood, actually, to go back and watch a lot of old school slasher movies. So let me know down in the comments below, what do you think are the quintessential slasher movies from like the late 70s or even like the early 70s up through like the late 80s? And by that point, I feel like this, like the classic slasher genre had kind of run out of gas. And then obviously in the 90s, you had the resurrection thanks to Scream. But the problem with Scream was that everybody had learned the wrong lessons from it. And suddenly we got all these lousy PG-13 kind of wannabe slasher movies featuring all these kind of, like these attractive, like pretty boys with like poofy lips and that sort of thing. And they didn't have the raw vitality or intensity of some of those early movies where people were making movies like, let's hire Tom Savini and just turn him loose and just see what he comes up with. And another problem with those late 90s slasher movies is that people started showing up just to see what kind of clever kill sequences were going to be introduced in the movie, but like the movies wouldn't have cool visual styles or cool music or interesting characters or anything like that. And but I recognize, like, maybe I'm in the minority, but if you are one of those slasher fans that just wants to see elaborate kills, all I can say is that there's at least one, kind of 1.5 kills in this movie that will absolutely scratch your itch on that front. But I think I've said all about all I can say about In a Violent Nature. But at a minimum, during this very strange summer where so many movies are failing to find an audience, maybe In a Violent Nature will be some interesting counter-programming for some people. If The Fall Guy is not your thing, and if Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is not your thing, if Furiosa is not your thing, well then maybe a little weird, low-budget Canadian horror film might scratch your itch. So let me know what you think down in the comments below if you've already seen it. And hopefully I've put this movie on some people's radar that might potentially enjoy it once it goes wide later this weekend. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.